Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Razam Pereira. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Japanese counterpart Shinzo Abe on Monday reviewed the evolving security scenario in the Indo-Pacific and agreed to further bolster bilateral cooperation in third countries for peace, prosperity and development in the region. The two leaders held a meeting on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit in Bangkok, during which China's fast expanding military and economic expansionism in the Indo-Pacific region figured prominently. The Ministry of External Affairs said that the two leaders also deliberated on the inaugural 2+2 Indo-Japan Foreign and Defence Ministerial Dialogue later this month in India, noting that it will help provide impetus to the security and defence cooperation between the two sides. On this edition of India's World, we will analyse the bilateral relations between India and Japan. Joining me on the program today are S.R. Tayal, former ambassador, Titli Basu, Associate Fellow, Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, and Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. First, let's try and analyse and understand the status of the bilateral relationship between India and Japan.
I would put it in the context of this 2+2 meeting at the minister level. I think both Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are very conscious of what is going on in Indo-Pacific, how the equations are changing, how new challenges are coming up, and realizing that last October when they met, they had resolved in the joint vision statement that the 2+2 dialogue was there earlier also at Vice Minister level since about 2010, Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary at our side, that it should be raised to Minister level. And really what is happening is under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that the self-defence forces have their self-imposed restrictions on how they operate, what is the geographical reach of their operations, the Japanese self-defence forces. But gradually, incrementally, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's guidance, that scope is being enhanced, is being increased. And the latest challenge which has come is because of President Donald Trump's policies of burden sharing, cost sharing, and now United States is no longer dependent on the oil from the Gulf. Whereas countries like India and Japan, Korea, we are so much dependent on oil from the Gulf. So ultimately, perhaps in the future, India, Japan, some other countries will have to work together to secure the oil from the Gulf and what happens in Iran if there is some conflict. So there are very new challenges which have come up, and that is perhaps the background of this directive which came from the two prime ministers, that the 2+2 should meet, the two defence ministers and external affairs ministers should meet before they meet for their annual summit, perhaps before the end of the year. So I would put it in that context, that how India and Japan work together in a strategic atmosphere in Indian Ocean, in the Gulf, and also in the neighborhood, in for instance Sri Lanka, for instance Myanmar, for instance Maldives, because we have to occupy that space, otherwise China will occupy that space. India has very goodwill, India has a lot of historic relations, connectivities, but we lack money. And China is coming with huge amounts of money, as all of our viewers know, and it is only with the help of Japan perhaps that we can give an alternative, give a better alternative to our neighbors, including in Sri Lanka.
All right. Harshpan, talking about the 2+2 dialogue, let's talk about the other 2+2 dialogue. We saw it running into some kind of trouble, had to be postponed on several occasions with the US. But from Japan's perspective, what is it that we can expect when we have the inaugural 2+2?
I think what this 2+2 dialogue like 2+2 does is it signifies two things. One, it signifies that we are at a stage now where both Tokyo and New Delhi are looking at this relationship from a holistic perspective. It doesn't make sense to have a foreign policy and a defense dialogue being conducted separately, and because the relationships are so intertwined, engagement is so intertwined, that it makes sense to look at the relationship in totality. And I think the fact that this is our second dialogue of its kind with the nation, it also signifies how the positive trajectory on which Indo-Japanese relationship has been moving for quite some time now. So clearly there is a sense of comfort in each other, which I think is relatively rare in international relations, and it's also at this pivotal point where, as was being outlined, so much is happening around Japan, around India, in the geographies that we are located, that it makes sense for us to have this dialogue, more or less, a dialogue that encompasses our foreign policy and security priorities together, and also help perhaps in redefining some of the priorities that are set by the leadership, because this will be I think after that will be followed by our annual summit between the two leaders. So it will be very important for the two ministers, defense and foreign ministers of both countries, to lay out that roadmap, which then can be operationalized. At this point, the relationship is largely driven by the prime ministers. It's a personality-driven relationship. 2+2 institutionalizes that relationship in a very fundamental manner. So if you have this consultation every year annually, then it means that the two bureaucracies are in sync with each other, and two very important bureaucracies, foreign policy and defense bureaucracies. And I think the kind of relationship that both the prime ministers envision for India and Japan, envision the kind of geopolitical remapping that they envision for Indo-Pacific, it's critical that the bureaucracies are aligned in a manner that perhaps this institutionalization would allow them to do. And going forward, as you look at some of the critical aspects of this relationship, which have been outlined but are still being operationalized. So whether you have the connectivity projects that India and Japan are involved in, whether you have third-party projects that again, whether in the neighborhood or elsewhere that India and Japan are involved in, this dialogue would be very instrumental in giving concrete shape to them, because a lot of the times what we see and what we visualize in a relationship like India and Japan is that some of the conversations have become never-ending. For example, the amphibious aircraft, the thing that we have been discussing now for so many years, it is yet to reach fruition. I think the bullet train project is also moving very, very gradually. So there are a number of projects which are very important for both these countries. But because I think it is now reliant solely on the prime ministers, I think the institutionalization of this kind allows some of the burden to be given to the bureaucracies to resolve them and to operationalize them in a speedier manner. So I more or less, I think it underscores a lot of the positives that the ambassador was talking about, in the sense of where the relationship is going, and perhaps also lay out a roadmap in operationalizing some of those very, very positive opportunities that exist for Delhi and Tokyo.
Absolutely. And talking from a defense point of view, Titli Basu, what is the level of cooperation between India and Japan, and where do you see it going?
Well, defense cooperation between India and Japan is a very important component of our overarching special strategic and global partnership that we have conceived with the Japanese and elevated it in a couple of years ago. And we have seen considerable progress. If you see from 2008, when we actually started the security cooperation, defining it in within the framework of the bilateral relationship, from there we have come a long way. If you look at 2015, we have till about 2015, our focus was mostly on joint exercises, a lot of exchange between the armed forces of the two countries, so on and so forth. We have a very well-defined institutionalized framework at the defense level. You can see the defense ministerial dialogue, the annual national security advisors dialogue, and so on and so forth. And annual, not only the Malabar exercises, which get a lot of attention, but we do have GEMEX, we do have also we do have the annual exercises at the between the Indian Army and the ground self-defense forces of the Japanese. We just finished it, the second round of our exercises in Mizoram. They have also participated now in the COPE India that we are having, and not just in terms of bilateral and the Malabar exercises. I think before the Malabar in July, of this year, all the three countries, India, US and Japan have, the navies have participated in mine surface exercises, I think in northern Japan. So there is a lot of, cooperation that is happening. But since 2015, I would say that the qualitative depth of the relationship has increased. We have seen two fundamental key agreements getting signed. One is on the defense, the agreement on defense technology and equipment cooperation, which again is supported by the agreement on protection of classified military information. But having said that, if we first look at the policy part of it, if you look at Japan's internal security policy, the trajectory that they are kind of embarking on right now, India has emerged as a critical anchor in their Indo-Pacific strategy, in their own defense and security, discussion and conversation in Tokyo. For example, if you look at their maiden national security strategy in 2013, it does talk about developing a very robust cooperation with India, particularly in terms of joint exercises and maritime exercises, followed by, if you look at all the consecutive national defense program guidelines, we just had the recent one in December 2018. It also outlines India's role, and also if you look at the annual defense white papers. So India consistently features in their national policy discourse. It's not just symbolism that they are, it's beyond when they are developing a network style security architecture to deal with the challenges and tap the opportunities in Indo-Pacific. So India is very much persistent in their idea of the Indo-Pacific, beyond the bilateral exercises, if we look at high-end technology cooperation, I would say that if we look at India's, when it comes to high-end technology cooperation, it's a very complicated domain. So we do see a lot of push from the Japanese business lobbies. If you look at the Keida and Rin policy papers that are emerging, or even the national, after 2014 when they eased the arms exports ban, Japan had a self-imposed arms export ban for a very long time. And when they eased it under, the scheme of, policies that Shinzo Abe has unfolded, we see that India, they are tapping into Indian market. They are interested in Indian market, the business lobbies. We have instituted certain forums, for example, India-Japan Defense Forum. We do have joint working groups between the two countries. But high-end technology cooperation entails a very, it's very complicated in terms of cost. There are the main issues of technology transfer, creating jobs within the Make in India program, and also because they conceive arms export within their own concept of a proactive contribution to peace. So even though Japan is a repository of dual-use technology, they are a manufacturing giant in terms of civilian technology, and there is a lot of dual-use technology that we can tap. Right. But we have been navigating the terrain of where there is markets like cost-sensitive markets like India, and when we are pursuing Make in India program, so US too has not it has taken longer than anticipated. We have a MOU that we signed earlier during I think with the Mahindras in 2018. But we have not seen considerable progress after that. We were expecting probably some movement when defense dialogue happened earlier this year. But having said that, we are taking small steps also in terms of co-development, joint production of technology. The DRDO and ATLA are working together in the domain of robotics and unmanned ground vehicles and so on and so forth. So right now probably, and we have actually invited the Japanese to participate in our submarine programs, and we have not really received the kind of response we were expecting.
So there's far more complexities there.
Of course, and especially with their experience in the Australian submarine deal. So they are also new to the global competitive market of arms trade.
Sure.
So we should focus more on joint development of smaller projects, probably, instead of focusing on big ticket items right away. Right. So that will, define the future of our defense and security cooperation.
Absolutely. All right. So, Ambassador, I think we are all in agreement that the relationship is in a good place as far as India and Japan are concerned. But are there any areas of the bilateral relationship that need special attention?
The core, I think, continues to be, as far as operations are concerned, in the economic development. Japan has invested a lot in India's economic development, infrastructure development. And for technological quantum jump, historically, if you see 1980s, early 1980s, Maruti came. And that Suzuki's investment and technology, that transformed India's transport sector. Then metro we see in Delhi and in other cities, again with Japanese assistance. Now these corridors, you go anywhere, Delhi, Mumbai economic corridor, now this Mumbai, Ahmedabad economic corridor or rail corridor. So in transportation, Japan has invested a lot and it has benefited India. It is taking India to a next level of technology. Again, this high-speed train, again, it takes India to a higher level. So that is where a long-term commitment of Japan is, to make India strong and to make India a real economic partner. Now, yes, their industry is still a little reluctant to invest in India. 2 or 3 of their investments have gone horribly wrong, whether it is in Ranbaxy, Tata Docomo, and so there have been issues, and as was mentioned by West German Chancellor just the other day, we have to keep on improving our make in our business environment, so that more and more Japanese companies come and invest. But the willingness is there. As it was said, it remains top driven. The 2 prime ministers are very committed, the 2 governments are very committed, but that response is not coming from the Japanese industry side. They are still investing more and more, of course, in China. If they are shifting from China, they are going to Vietnam.
Vietnam, yeah.
And that is where we have to really do a lot of introspection and see that despite this very great goodwill between the people of India and Japan, between the governments of India and Japan, why it is not getting translated into more investment. That is where the problem lies. And again, I would say perhaps more needs to be done by us within our own system, and really do case studies. And we have hand-holding organizations, even CII, Invest India, etc. But if one talks to foreign investors, whether they are Japanese or Korean, they still find India's environment very difficult to navigate.
Right. Sure.
And this is where we need to do more.
Right. Okay. Professor Pant, so since we're here and since you spoke about how several projects are moving gradually, and both the prime ministers have spoken about how we need to involve ourselves with a third country or a third region, there was one big ticket announcement that was made in 2017, the Asia-Africa Economic Corridor. Where does it stand right now, and what is the issue really as far as the economic corridor is concerned?
See, again, I think that is a project that in theory is extremely elegant. It brings together 2 important nations, and it was in some ways a response to the kind of breathtaking infrastructure development the Chinese are doing as part of their Belt and Road Initiative.
Several parallels were drawn saying that this could rival the BRI at some point.
At one point it was almost thought that if you could conceive of a project as elegant as that, if you could operationalize that, perhaps we would be able to accomplish much. I mean, the idea, the idea was basically to link Asia with Southeast Africa with Southeast Asia, and India and Japan being the 2 anchors in that. And in some ways, what India and Japan are doing together in a number of third countries, whether it's Myanmar or Sri Lanka, we're doing projects where India and Japan bring their expertise together. It was also an attempt to translate it into a bigger scale. So the idea was that India would take its experience in working with Africa along with Japanese money and technology, and we would try to create something of great value to the people, and it would be In contrast, and it's still, the idea still is that you have to offer something which is different from the Chinese. I mean, you cannot really have that kind of, you don't really have those kind of resources, but you have, what you have is an alternative model, which is bottom up, which is participatory, which is about what the demand driven, not top down. So I think that on paper it's a very sound project, and I think it has. But the problem is that it has not moved beyond the drawing boards of our planning. And I think there is a lot of frustration, I think, both in Delhi and in Tokyo to some extent, that bureaucracies in both countries have been dragging their foot on this issue. I think for Japan, again, it's a commitment which they deem that it's too big, and they want to go slow. So I think in some ways going slow is good, because if we are doing these investments in third countries like Myanmar or in Sri Lanka, we perhaps will be able to check and see whether we are capable of executing these projects. But I think the larger issue is also about whether the two visions converge, which in theory they do, but in terms of the nitty-gritty of managing specific projects in Africa, and then trying to bring it all to Southeast Asia, that remains a number of points that are still to be finalized.
Right.
So while I think the ambition on both sides remains that the two countries remain committed to the idea of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, the idea is also that perhaps let's start with something smaller, and there, at this point at least, it seems that we are not willing to take that entire leap. We are still willing to go slow. And I think a lot of it has to do with a certain hesitancy in Japan about India's ability to execute projects. This is something that you hear again and again.
Yeah.
That whether you end up into bilateral relationships or whether you enter into these sorts of trilateral or multilateral engagements, that there is a sense that India's ability to deliver on the ground still remains very weak, and that there are a number of factors that prevent India from following through its commitments. And while there has been considerable improvement in what we have been able to do on that front in the last few years, but I think the perception is still there. And I think that perhaps is also one of the factors why Japanese want us to go a bit slow on that, and that has clouded this growth corridor project a bit. But I hope that it moves forward, and I think you see that being discussed every time the two leaders meet, or every time these discussions happen.
Absolutely.
But I think operationally on the ground, nothing much seems to be happening, unfortunately.
Okay, all right, Titli Basu, let's talk about the Indo-Pacific now, and where does Japan fit into India's scheme of things in the Indo-Pacific, and also is China the common factor?
Well, Japan is a very important actor in our Act East policy, and Act East is again an important component of a larger Indo-Pacific strategy that we have. And as we all know that in 2015, both India and Japan have come together, and we have outlined a joint vision 2025 for the Indo-Pacific. Now, obviously, if you look at the discourse, whether it is in New Delhi or in Tokyo or in Washington, often our bilateral relationship is analyzed through the prism of rise of China and its hegemonic aspirations in Asia, or how it is trying to evolve a Sinocentric Asian order in terms of by challenging some of the key components of the rule-based order that we have operated, and the structures that are in place. But having said that, we also need to understand, as was discussed here, there are some new nuances that we need to keep in mind. For example, Japan is a formal US alliance partner since the post-war period. And India's foreign policy orientation has been a little bit different from that. We have never, obviously under Prime Minister Modi, we have seen a lot of, we have stepped up our strategic coordination, whether it is in bilateral framework or trilateral framework or quadrilateral consultative mechanisms that we have developed. But this also happens within the larger parameter of our vision of a multipolar order in the region. So having said that, but again, we do have certain commonalities when we look at Japan's Indo-Pacific vision and India's, how Prime Minister Modi has defined Indo-Pacific vision. And there are a lot of commonalities where we can come together, and we have come together, and we are trying to work together, whether it is, you know, in terms of sharing responsibility, in terms of securing the maritime commons, providing, you know, a sharing responsibility in terms of providing global goods, securing the stocks, so on and so forth. And we are also, infrastructure is again a very important component of our strategy, whether it is Act East. We are trying to connect to Southeast Asia for decades now, and Japanese cooperation in the Northeast particularly has been quite encouraging for us because of the concessional loans that the terms and conditions of the loans that we are getting from the Japanese side. And that is, and again, that the Bay of Bengal is, if you look at the sub-regions within the Indo-Pacific, for example, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Bay of Bengal, these are areas which are on high priority when you look at, you know, where India and Japan can come together and work. We are, you know, looking at projects in Bangladesh, smaller projects, and also strategically important Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. And we are trying to connect through our trilateral highway for a very long time. So, and then Japan has its own infrastructure projects, the East-West Economic Corridor in Southeast Asia. So, if we can connect through that and then tap into the idea is basically to tap into the regional value chains and production networks that are there in the emerging markets. And one of the reasons why India has not been able to participate or you know, take the full advantage of the economic component of our relationships, not just with Japan but with all these dynamic economies, is because we are not connected or integrated with the supply chains that are operating in this market.
Right, and that's something that we need to focus on.
Of course, infrastructure is one way which will you know, go a long way in supporting, and also our coordination in multilateral you know frameworks. For example, in ASEAN, at a time when ASEAN has also outlined its own Indo-Pacific outlook. So that is more in line with our Prime Minister Modi's focus on inclusivity.
Right. Okay. So let me get closing comments from the other guests as well, because I've got very limited time on the program. Very quickly, Ambassador, the best way forward.
Best way forward is to concentrate on delivery, as was mentioned, and in Northeast, Japan is doing very well. The JICA has lots of projects. So in the connectivity, Northeast connectivity with the Myanmar and Myanmar to Thailand. And the concentration perhaps should be more on projects and delivery in the neighborhood, and perhaps Asia-Africa Growth Corridor would be lower down in the priorities. Okay, all right. Professor?
Well, I think bringing in more stakeholders into this conversation, it is very good that the you know, engagement is being driven from the top. But I think unless the industry, for example, Japanese industry in particular, is enthused about its participation in India, it would be very difficult to sustain the economic basis of this engagement. So the more stakeholders we have, you know, supporting this relationship, the better it is for the future of this relationship.
All right, and Titli Basu, close the show for us with your quick concluding remark.
I'll just say that with the 2+2 coming and followed by the annual summit that we will be having in December, I think it only reflects the kind of these two Asian economies and major powers in the Indo-Pacific are actually invested in you know, forward thinking and conceiving new ideas, playing with you know, new strategies. Of course, we have to focus on the delivery part of it, but at least the conversation and the idea, strategic coordination is on, which is a very positive, which will set the positive tone for the future of India-Japan relations.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India as well. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.